Hello. Welcome to the Beyond Solitaire podcast. As always, I am your host, your only host, the only one who has ever been your host. I am Dan Thoreau, and I am joined for the very first time a novel guest on this podcast in her very first novel appearance, Liz Davidson. Welcome, Liz.
Yeah, it's such an honor to be on this podcast. Your work has been fantastic for the last couple seasons.
Thank you. This is my baby. And I invest a lot into this podcast. It was my COVID project, uh, and so I'm just happy that you're here. Thank you so much. I've interviewed 57 people, um, and I hope that you will be the finest interviewee of all.
Of course, how could it be otherwise?
So, so lately you have been writing this wonderful series of articles. Wasn't it six? Is it six entries?
Yes, 6 parts.
Okay, so a six-part series, and this is a series that actually has been one of the series in board gaming that I have been most excited about all year. This is a series on gladiators.
Yes, it is about gladiators. Wait, were you actually excited about this?
Yes, of course. I didn't know about it until you linked me like the second one. But from that moment through the conclusion, yes, this is one of the projects I was most excited about this year in board games. I am not lying.
I really
I
appreciate that. Thank you.
exaggerate, but I never lie.
A true critic.
Yes. So my first and most pressing question, Liz, is why? And the reason I ask this is because I bet this is what's on a number of people's minds. Why are you such a scold? Aren't board games supposed to be fun? So why would you tell us we're not allowed to play a game about gladiators?
I never told anybody they weren't allowed to play anything. Also, who said that games? Who said that games are supposed to be fun? I'm an educator. My entire job is to take the fun out of everything. No kidding. No. So actually, the real reason I wrote this is that first of all, so I haven't been writing as much on my site this year. I realized I wasn't really enjoying doing written reviews, and it was making me unhappy to try to push myself to write them. But I do like to write. And so then the question becomes, what is it that I want to write? And it turns out that what I want to write is like pseudo academic work
Mhm.
about board games, which I suppose makes sense because you can take me out of the ivory tower, but you can't take the ivory tower out of me. Like, but I think I just wanted to try something that would interest me as a project. I'd been thinking about the fact that Hoplomachus had just come out with Hoplomachus Victorum, and I was wondering why I like this gladiator game so much above all others. The Latin world is kind of roiled all the time right now about how to teach Roman culture in a way that is sensitive to our students who have no other blueprint other than what we give them for Roman
Mhm.
culture. And so everything just kind of came together into, well, what does everybody want to talk about and play about? Gladiators. What should I do? Ruin it for everyone. And no. And a series was born.
Well, so I was curious because you actually open with that disclaimer in your very first piece where you say, "I'm not trying to tell you what to play or not to play." Why did you choose to open with that disclaimer? Why did you feel that need?
I felt that need because I think that we are currently in a spot in our industry where if you criticize something or you have some sort of nitpick about it, that might mean that you think that no one should ever play it, that no one should ever buy it, or that, that is problematic, which is a word that you and I, have talked about before.
Right.
I that's not really where I'm trying to go with my series, right? It's sort of like what we talked about last time. Historical criticism is not cancellation, and it's
Hmm.
not trying to tell you that you can't play something. You need to make your own choice about what you're playing anyway. For me, it's more of just, I really like looking at the way that Roman culture plays out in our culture, because I think that it's a way for me to think about myself and my world through the lens of the ancient world, where I also spend a lot of my mental and emotional time. And I wanted to see what would happen if I kind of smooshed them together and brought something out of that experiment.
Yeah. So where did the experiment come from? So you mentioned Hoplomachus. Was there a moment or a game that made your the math come out of your mind, and everyone was and you were going, this is something I have to talk about?
Actually, part of it too is that, so I'm not a game designer, but, and sorry Mike, I'm not trying to break any news because there's no news, but he and I joke all the time that we're going to make a Gladiator game at some point,
Hmm.
that we should make a solo Gladiator game, and that'd be really fun. Maybe someday it'll happen, hopefully, because I think actually it would be really fun. But it
Yeah.
also got me thinking about, okay, but I don't want to make a game that is just straight up gladiators fighting, because I mean, would we have it be like you own the gladiators? Will we have it be like, and then I realized that nobody else thinks about this the way that I do. So for those of you who have not read my series, how dare you, first of all. But second of all, but second of all, basically, I wrote a series of blog posts, like a article in parts about how gladiators were, the majority of gladiators were slaves. They did not have bodily autonomy when they were forced to go into the arena and hurt, sometimes kill each other. And that, that is something that we have not been particularly sensitive to in our board games, because we want all the fun and blood with none of the guilt. And when I was thinking about what would it be like if I made a gladiator game, I realized that I was hitting a mental block, because it would be unacceptable to me to make a game that ignored that.
Hmm.
And so I wondered why, and I started poking around at other gladiator games that were out there, and then decided to put it all together into a series.
Yeah. So speaking of bodily autonomy and things that are taken out, so you mentioned, for instance, the genesis of this gladiatorial combat actually comes out of Roman funerary rituals.
Oh
And
yes.
I love that you mentioned that, because Roman burial and funerary practices are actually what I wrote my thesis on. So,
Ooh.
so why don't you give us the short version of how that occurred? Because I think a lot of people would be like, what does that have to do with, what does A have to do with B?
Well, I think what's sort of interesting is that, at least in my reading so far, it's somewhat mysterious how this started.
Hmm.
People seem to think that the Romans got this idea from the Etruscans, that there should be some sort of, almost like a blood sacrifice, a ritualistic fight at a funeral. And there's lots of ways to approach this, right? The idea is that the dead aren't, it's not like you die and your awareness goes away. The dead are hungry. The shades are hungry. So people would bring food and wine to tombs that were outside of the city every year, if they still gave a crap about their poor ancestors. Okay.
Yeah.
If you read the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, blood is a very likable sacrifice for the dead, because it reminds them of being alive. And so this idea of sort of bleeding for and like dying for a death isn't that weird if you think about it in the context of larger Roman culture. The problem is that, as rich people um, are wont to do, a lot of times they also have very fancy funerals. So, you also have this situation where Roman families with famous forebears will have what are called the imagenes. So just imagine that your great grandpa was a really famous person. So when he died, they made a wax mask of his face, and it's in a prominent display in the front room of your house. Like,
Creepy.
welcome to Rome. And then people in the family would like wear these as part of the funeral procession, and you'd pay mourners to pretend to be sad and, like, beat their chest and wail and rip their hair out and go to this big public funeral, and people were expected to kind of go. It's a spectacle. And so
Yeah.
part of the spectacle is gladiator fight. And then the spectacles get bigger, and then you end up with Julius Caesar honoring his dead father many years after the fact, but actually gaining a lot of popular favor by throwing the biggest gladiator games ever, and off we go.
Yeah. Don't you feel like haven't you been to a funeral that would have been improved by having, like, not a fight to the death, but a fight?
Honestly, it would be better than the tension of like slowly simmering family resentments and quiet weeping. I'd rather just have the fight.
Yeah. I feel like you could really, like, break through the ice.
Right?
You,
Right?
like, pick.
Especially, didn't somebody's uncle write into his will that he wanted two hot girls to fight at his funeral?
Yes,
Like, that
yes.
was.
I know a lot of people who would be in support of a hot girl fight at a funeral. I will have to make no comment on that. That sounds like the kind of thing that could come back to bite me. So So here's kind of this weird. So gladiators, to me, as someone who studied a little bit about gladiators and who's now read your series, there's kind of this weird tension there because we have this perception of gladiators, and board games support this, that they're these ancient rock stars, right? They're
Yes.
big, they're burly, they've got 57 chest muscles that they flex in inappropriately suggestive ways. The crowd goes wild for them. People want to bed them. But the reality is kind of complicated because they're also what's the word, infamia.
Yes. Yeah,
And
they're
so
infames. Yeah.
what's that tension, and why is that so interesting, and why doesn't that show up in board games?
So I think part of the reason it doesn't show up in board games is because we don't understand it. It's so when you talk about gladiators as rock stars, right? You are in fact getting the truth. It's just
Yeah,
half of the truth.
right.
Gladiators were sex gods. People made graffiti of them. In Pompeii we have one who's suspirium puellarum. Oh, he's the heartthrob of the girls. People absolutely paid to have sex with gladiators, and gladiators who wanted to live longer would often very deliberately wear less armor and make sure that they oiled their chest muscles up real good so that all 57 of them are gleaming in the sun, so that if
Yeah,
somebody has to decide if you're going to live or die, they want you to live so they can look at you next time. There's definitely I'm hot aspect to being a gladiator. They had like if you think about slaves, right? We think about people who aren't allowed to go anywhere, aren't allowed to do anything. Gladiators' weapons were locked up, but it, from our perspective, it just seems quote not that bad because they
yeah.
had a lot of I hate saying it this way because it's so gross, right? And that's what makes this such a hard topic. Like they had a lot of privileges and freedoms. It's just that they also had no real legal rights. And also, Romans are very finicky about people who sell their bodies for entertainment. That
Hmm.
is not just about prostitutes. So, like in the United States, when you say that, you think of like sex workers. But for Romans, it was just as bad to be an actress, to be a dancer, to be a gladiator, to be a charioteer, to be any of these jobs where you are essentially selling your body for public consumption and entertainment. And people are transfixed by it, but they're also deeply repelled by it. And like, you can't be Mr. Sexy Gladiator and then go marry a well off woman without it being a massive scandal. And if
Hmm.
you are an aristocrat, you cannot. I mean, we have all these stories where we have to focus, right? Like, oh, Commodus thought he was a gladiator and he won in the arena, and Maximus killed him. Okay, that's actually completely historically inaccurate, but he was into the gladiator thing. But it was bad for him to be into that. People would have looked at that and been like, "Ooh, that's like if you're gonna get canceled for something in ancient Rome, it's that kind of thing that gets you canceled. Like you don't
Right.
do it." And so, it's really interesting to see like, oh, fame and glory and wanting the best gladiatorial house and everyone loves you and you are thrilled by the roar of the crowd. And it's kind of like, well, that same crowd ain't going to have dinner with you. They're not going to look at you in the street and treat you like a friend, really. You are entertainment meat that is, they might have an action figure of you, but they don't want you.
Do you think there's any modern parallel to that? I mean, even just speaking now, um, I'm thinking about like TikTok influencers or something, like someone
Mm.
that you like to watch, but you wouldn't want to hang out with them necessarily.
Okay, so how political do we want to get? It's my podcast still, even though you've served it for
No, it's
me.
my
We're gonna get
podcast.
political.
I think you can get political.
Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about then. Let's talk about politics and sports. So I love to go to baseball games. And at baseball games, I'm a fairly liberal person. I'm surrounded by a lot of people who definitely aren't. And we all know there's social signifiers in this country, for you to tell somebody's general political persuasion, who love to go watch immigrant athletes play ball. They do,
Sure,
and look at football. Look at what happened with Kaepernick.
sure.
People want, look at Shut Up and Play with, was that LeBron who was told that when he had a political opinion? We don't
I
have
don't
something
know.
like, we don't have something that's as dramatic, right, in our culture as like, I own your life and also you're kind of hot. Like it's not quite like that here, right?
Yeah, sure.
But kind of close enough sometimes. Like we have people who love to play sports, who make big money to play sports, but then when they want to assert their opinions or their personalities or their needs beyond that sport in ways that are culturally uncomfortable for people who watch their sport, then they get slammed. And I mean, what is that if not a reborn version of the idea that you shut up and play for my entertainment and you don't matter outside of
Yeah, sure. I was going to say that's a way better example than mine.
that? Yeah, I mean, the thing about influencers too, though, like I think that everybody we live in a culture where we're all kind of selling ourselves a little bit. Does that make sense? Like,
Hmm.
we're sitting here on YouTube making a podcast that we hope people will listen to.
Yeah,
Um, we're selling some sort of product, even if it's not for very much money. And we commodify so much of our culture now. Like, it's hard to have a hobby without trying to commodify it in some way.
yeah,
Um, we have a combination of love and scorn for our actors, who also we like, just like the Romans, right? We want to watch them perform. We are often emotionally moved by their performances. Maybe we want their autograph, we want to touch them. They're famous, but that doesn't mean that you actually respect what they have to say.
yeah.
Sometimes for good reason, but sometimes not. Sometimes it's just because it's like, shut up and be in a movie.
So could you walk us through? So you've established that there's kind of this myth. How does this play out in a board game? I mean, you even mentioned like a board game called Gladius, which apparently has received plaudits from an art historian, Seth McCormick, for its focus on, honestly, being representing anyone other than Julius Caesar. Um, and you still have some critique to offer about this game that even though it's received plaudits.
Yes. Okay, so we'll do the lead up to that. This is actually the most interesting case study for me, and I didn't want to wail on it too hard for reasons that we'll get to, right? Because I think
Yeah.
this is like the essence of talking about history and talking about yourself at the same time and having a hard time slicing that. So, okay, there's a few different ways that board games deal with gladiatorial fights, within them. So one is to kind of pretend that the whole slavery thing isn't happening. A lot of times people would be like, wow, the best fighters and even emperors love to get into the arena, and sometimes slaves. It might
Yeah.
not show up at all. Or like,
Right.
oh, let's make a gladiator game that's overtly Roman and that mentions Roman things and has Latin in it. But these are all people who you're hiring to be in your gladiatorial show, which is complete bull. If you might hire a lanista to bring his property to your show, but like gladiators aren't free agents like that. That's not how this worked.
Hmm.
So you get kind of this element of erasure where we just kind of pretend it's not there. um Sometimes you just sort of get like, well, you're in this for the fame and glory of it, and that is true whether it's one where they've kind of erased the reality, or one where it's like, oh, you're a lanista and you want to bring glory to your house, and they kind of don't talk about what exactly that means and the human trafficking that would involve. Or you get people who are honest about it, but somehow the fame and glory is still the most important part. Like, I can't speak for gladiators. Like, they have tombstones, so they're clearly proud of the careers they had and their win and loss records. And some of them are free, and some of them were slaves and died in a condition of enslavement. And like, they probably had their own very varied opinions about their lives and what all that meant. But what we're doing is we're assuming that the glory and adulation of the audience was enough to justify wanting to go into that arena all the time and fight for the fun of fighting. And even if it's like, oh, you're trying to earn your freedom, like you have like Quest for the Rudis as a game that's about a gladiator trying to be free, there's still very much like a, you want to play to the crowd element of that. And like, even within Gladiator the movie, right? Win the crowd and you'll win your freedom. But like, we're complicit in that, right? Like we enjoy putting ourselves in that role for some reason. And I think it's because we're not really thinking about what that would actually mean.
Yeah.
And so for Gladius is an interesting case. So for everyone out there, I've never played Gladius. I have no problem with Gladius. Like, actually, I don't really have a problem with any of these games for the most part. Unless they're bad, I haven't played them off. They're not soloable. I typically don't. I went and looked through, rules text, flavor text. I don't need to know how the game plays to know how it's presenting historically for
Hmm.
this particular kind of project. But Gladius is a bidding game. It won a whole lot of praise because of the diversity of its art and because it showed both men and women. So
Hmm.
basically, it is a game that reflects values that our current gaming culture has. We want to see more inclusion. We want to see more people represented in the games we play. And that is a net good desire for us. And I completely believe that myself in my gaming life. However, it was interesting to see this mapped out on Gladiators because basically we were this game was receiving a lot of praise and a lot of adulation for its diversity and for how good that is based on our value set. But the premise of the game is that you are betting on gladiatorial matches and sometimes, fake betting and tricking people and causing wins and losses and influencing the outcome in the arena. So you essentially are looking at this diverse group of people who are manipulating the potential life outcomes of slaves in a
Mm-hmm.
Roman arena. And no one thought twice about it. And I think that's the truth. I think no one thought twice about it. Zero people actually worried about it because why would you? If you've played a bunch of Gladiator games and you're not really thinking about it, how would you know? Because we don't like to talk about it. You have to read pretty deep before you start really, like, even I think popular literature about gladiators, nobody likes to dwell on the slave part too much because we don't like it. Why
Yeah.
would you like it? It's kind of awful. And so I think that it's easy to miss, especially because I don't think that people are doing very deep research into their gladiator games because it doesn't feel necessary. But then it leads to unintended consequences. This one in particular, though, was interesting because by asking an art historian, so okay, I don't know Seth MacCormick really. I would not be able to pick him out of a lineup. I've never engaged with any of his work. We exchanged messages once because he wanted to teach himself Latin. So that will tell you about the degree to which he's a Roman historian, and I will say no more. But he was pulled for a quote as a professor to talk about this game, saying that he thinks that diversifying representation in games is really important for broadening perspectives on history. And he goes into like a whole thing about how Gladius is shifting attention to the agency of the Roman people and away from the Roman leaders that we normally tend to talk about in our games about Rome, which is an entire other article series that will be really interesting one day. But he turns into this whole thing about agency and about the people and about how popularizing this is and how great that is in terms of perspectives on Rome. And no one stops to think about the fact that we're betting on a bunch of slaves.
Yeah.
And that is the most exquisitely uncomfortable thing I have ever witnessed in terms of like a historical misfire.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, like from my perspective as a Roman historian, I'm like, like, is this really here? And again, like, I don't know this game. I don't know these designers. I'm not saying this in like a personal way or like you shouldn't play it or you can't enjoy it. I am saying everybody missed the boat on this because no one knew anything about Roman history and we just went with it.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I feel like you mentioned in there a couple times is this idea of, earning the adulation of the crowd, glory.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, board games, one of the things that makes them exciting as historical tools is their ability to model incentives, right? And one of the things that I feel they do great at is modeling the value incentive behind, because that's the victory condition, right? That whatever your victory condition is, that's what you value.
Oh, yes.
And so in a lot of these gladiator games, you are going for glory. So talk us through a bit. So are those accurate incentives, things like glory or money, or do they only capture a portion of this historical dynamic?
So I think what makes this such a thorny problem, and one of the reasons I was so attracted to writing about it, is that it's like a both situation. Like, yes,
Mm-hmm.
people would have cared about glory and money. Like the whole point of being a gladiator and wanting to be that, instead of being one of those unlucky slaves who dies in a salt mine, is that at least you get to maybe make a little money, get some lovin' because people really liked gladiators, get a little bit of crowd adulation because with that comes the possibility of freedom. So none
Mm-hmm.
of these things are in themselves, I think, valuable enough to be gladiator unless there were people who kind of got so caught up in the idea that people really like to watch gladiators that they wanted to be one. I
Yeah.
think everybody kind of fantasizes about like, wow, people really love to watch X thing. Maybe I want to be that. And it certainly happened, but it's a notable case. I think for most gladiators, this is really more about, okay, well, this is essentially the career that I have. So I can't get out of it. So I need money and I need fame so that I need to be famous enough that if I lose this fight, nobody's going to vote that I get killed. And I need this money so I can buy my way out if I ever want to.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really different kind of motivation than like, I'm the best. Yeah. You know what I mean? And
Right.
it just really adds levels of nuance and like complexity to the problem, because pure people love me is not enough when you're in that situation, or at least it would not have been for me. And it certainly wasn't enough for Spartacus, which is why you have like the largest slave revolt in the history of Rome is among gladiators. I mean, you know, to me, that kind of speaks for itself. And the fact they felt a need to crucify every single captured gladiator when that army ultimately lost and string them up along the roads. I mean, they wanted it to never happen again because it was terrifying for the establishment that was so used to kind of having these people fight, but only for entertainment purposes for them. And, you know, I think that we don't, you know, it's so easy to ignore. And actually, in my ultimate conclusions to the series, right? Like the reason it's easy to ignore, well, there's a couple reasons why. Do we want to get into this now? Or am I jumping to the end?
You, I don't know. Why don't we pause on that for just a minute?
Yeah.
So, I mean, another representative question that I have that maybe predates that a little bit is you contrast two different approaches, for example, to representing Lanisti. So the
Mm-hmm.
trainers of gladiators. So in many cases, you argue, for instance, the less savory aspects of running a gladiatorial school are played down or omitted entirely. So what would some of those be that we just don't even see in board games?
All right. So let's look at my own work. Because you got to start somewhere, right? I also have to write things out because I just forget, to be honest, which is
Uh
maybe
huh.
kind of weird. But let's see. Okay, so one thing that I do want to point out is that Lanistae are considered infames as well, just like gladiators are. And so, you know, when we are talking about having a gladiator school, right? This is not like some gladiator schools were like government owned, but there were also government owned slaves, actually, which is sort of fascinating. But you know, you have this idea of kind of Lanise as a manager, and I think that makes it easier to kind of pretend they're not doing what they're doing because they're responsible for training of gladiators and setting up the teams and booking the, you know, assignments and all that kind of stuff. And so I think it's really easy to be like, oh, well, that's all they did. No, they went and bought people. Like that old
Yeah.
guy that bought Maximus in the Gladiator movie, that dude's a Lanista. He's a former gladiator who turned around and bought other slaves to make them fight to make him money. And you
Yeah.
can think a lot, I think, about, you know, he's kind of presented as a likable, almost heroic character in that movie. No, he's a jerk, just like
Yeah.
everybody else who buys
Right.
other people. But like, so for example, there was one that was called Munera Familia Gladiatoria. So one thing's kind of interesting about Rome is that familia could include the actual nuclear family and blood relatives. Slaves were also called part of the familia in the
Right.
larger sense. So this is Roman terminology, but I'm not sure that the people who make the game know that. Does that make sense?
Right. Right.
So you're told to play the role of a Lanista who is an entrepreneur, who is investing wealth in, you know, a gymnasium of gladiators. Gymnasium is a very interesting term because you would never call it's called a ludus, a gladiator school. A gymnasium is where normal people go to work out and it's fine. Actually, gymnazo is like the Greek verb for I work out naked. So like go forth everyone. But but
Right.
but you're doing it with the aim of making it the most glorious of the empire. You will recruit trainers, armorers, medics, and even prostitutes. You will train free men, slaves, criminals, and war prisoners. So note that we're using the word recruit here. You will recruit these various people. You
Yeah.
will train free men and slaves. Where did you get them? No, it's like it's just kind of hidden in there. And so like this is something I'll link all the actual article parts below for those of you who like that subtle read on things. But for me, what really catches my eye is that really subtle way that the wording erases what's really happening. And
Right.
it makes it so easy to skate over. It's not you will purchase slaves that you will then train to send to their potential deaths in the arena and make money. This is very glorious. It's you will train free people, slaves, criminals. Note that slaves is kind of in the middle there too. It's not even they led with free people. And before that, they led with armorers and medics. and trainers. It's information that they know in this description, right? But it's not information that's going to be fronted. And I think that that kind of linguistic choice is meaningful.
Yeah.
I always tell my students, right, when you write, you're saying something even if you don't think that you are.
Right. And I actually, like, a student example very recently is one of my students wrote about the triangle trade and talking about slaves traveling across the Atlantic Ocean. And I said, well, so you're right. Your paper is very good, but they did not travel. Passengers travel. Cargo is shipped. They were shipped.
Yeah.
And you need to be very clear about the terminology you're using, because this was not some tourist, you know, movement. It was, they were not willing colonists who would have traveled. They were packed as cargo. They were treated as cargo. They were shipped. So I think that you're exactly right.
Yeah. The words you choose mean something. The other thing that's very interesting is that you have these games. So, like this Gladiator Quest for the Rudest game from 2016, right? It was like a little Kickstarter project that was very concerned with accuracy, which is why I picked it up. And it's about gaining your freedom in the first volume. And then there's an unpublished volume 2 that was supposed to be where you're free now and you take on the role of Villanista and you turn right around and start
Yeah.
getting some more gladiator slaves that you're going to deploy in the arena. And I thought that was just fascinating because if you've done this whole arc about earning your freedom, why does it make sense to you that the next arc would be about you turning around and doing what was done to you that you clearly did not like because you wanted to fight your way free?
Mm-hmm.
Like, where is our mental disconnect where that seems like a good idea? And then you also get games where like the Lenista are presented probably as closer to the way they really were, even though it's definitely salacious, which is like Spartacus, a game of blood and treachery.
Right.
I okay, judge me. I love that game. You're a complete asshole in that game. Like, you are not a good person, and you do not play that game to role play as a good person. It is ridiculous. It is silly. The show is ridiculous and silly. I watched the hell out of that show. I would
Yes,
watch it
me too.
again.
Yeah.
Like, I am not saying that you cannot enjoy problematic entertainment. Does that make
Sure.
sense? But you
Right.
have to be aware. And one thing I actually sort of enjoyed about this game was that it was so aware of how filthy and awful they were. Like, you could even pit a helpless slave against a real gladiator to like bet on a match. It's foul. It's real.
Yeah.
And so, like, the only thing that bothers me about it is that people think it's funny because it's so shocking. But actually, that's probably the most historically accurate of the games in terms of attitude towards your cargo, so to speak.
Right.
And that actually bothers me that like all these games are really like making these big claims to historical accuracy and like armor stats and gladiator types and names and all those sorts of things don't capture the heart of the enterprise in the way that I personally feel that Spartacus does, because at least Spartacus is real about how foul it all really is.
Right. It's very lurid
Yes.
in its honesty, and it depicts so much. You acquire slaves in the exact same way that you acquire a shield.
Yep.
Uh, you just put them on auction and you buy them. And that can include slaves who are good earners or slaves that you just kind of want to throw into the arena, and prostitutes.
Yep.
It just makes no bones about what it's about, and it's a hell of a good time. It is a really good game. Um,
It
so
is.
do,
It just knows itself.
it does. It knows exactly what it's doing. Do you feel bad about liking it so much?
I want to say that I do because I feel like that would make me a better person, but I don't. I don't. Like, okay, so I feel like this is a really good point for a disclaimer, right? And so Roman slavery is wrong no matter how you paint it. There's no such thing as ethical ownership of another human being, period. However, Roman slavery did not work the way that the slavery that kind of continues to impact our modern life did.
Yeah.
It's not racially based. There is a system within Rome for slaves to be freed, and then within a couple of generations to become more integrated in society. Although people who know you're descended from slaves will always judge you as less than like a finely bred Roman. And you know, slaves lived in the household with the family in many cases. A freedman might choose to do the freedman might take his master's actual family name and become a member of his family in a legal way, and then turn around and continue to do business with him. Freedmen from the imperial household actually ended up becoming the most politically powerful people in Rome because emperors like Claudius trusted them more than they trusted senators who did not owe
Right.
their good luck in life. Except I don't know how you can call that good luck, but Romans might, to an emperor. And so we're talking about a very different system of understanding ownership of other humans and the relationships that we can have with them. That is not to say that it was okay or that slaves had it pretty good, because they didn't. They died horrible deaths. They had no autonomy over their bodies. They were raped. They were killed for no reason. There's nothing good about it. But I think it's really, I think it's important to bring this up because it's easier, I think, to detach from the reality of what you're doing because it doesn't resemble what we understand as the purest of evils in our own society.
Right. So was it common for gladiators to become freedmen, or was that how common was that sort of thing?
I don't have the perfect statistics in this. I'm going to say that it was mostly the dream. It happened,
Yeah,
but you had to be successful. If you're just kind of like a mediocre gladiator, you live a short, unremarked life and away you go. There always has to be filler for the show. So they're actually, disgustingly, right? Like the big matches at gladiator fights would be like between this champion and that champion, and everybody was really into it. But like during the bathroom break part of the day, it could either be just paired fighters that nobody gave a crap about and like whatever. And so that's horrible. Like you just fill the arena with a bunch of randos who have to fight each other, and like that's just terrifying. Um, or they might be filled with beast fights where Romans also imported lots of exotic animals from throughout the empire and just had them killed in the arena.
yeah,
So, this is about blood and abuse and just general awfulness. So when we think about feeling bad about playing something like Spartacus, right? Like I think I don't think there's anything wrong with enjoying something that is a game on its just base level. I do think you have to be aware, though, that like it's really not okay. It's sort of like in Skyrim if you go get the Daedric artifacts, right? You have to like do human sacrifice. You have to perform. You have to commit cannibalism.
sure.
You have to do horrible things in the game in order to get all the Daedric artifacts, right? And they're evil. I think it's okay to role play as evil under a lot of circumstances. I also think that you can't pretend that that's not what you're doing,
Hmm.
if that makes sense. You can't brush it off. You can't act like it was just innocent fun. You have to be honest. And, that's where I think Gladius made its mistake, right? It's, very much look how inclusive and wonderful this is. This is a wonderful reflection of autonomy, etc. But actually, you're doing the exact same thing that happens in Spartacus.
Yeah.
So,
So I've written a little bit about some troublesome historical issues as well, and one of the questions that is often thrown out, and I think that often this is meant sort of rhetorically dismissively, is people will ask, well, why do you care about colonialism, but don't care about like Egyptian slavery or something
right,
like that? And usually, it's pretty easy to see that this is a rhetorical tool that is meant to dismiss. It's kind of saying, well, you're a hypocrite, right? That you don't care about Egyptian slavery. You only care about this slavery.
right.
Um, so how does this apply to you and gladiators? Why is this an issue that you feel so strongly about, that you've written a 6-part series and looked at a lot of board games? Why this and not some other issue? Why is this one important to you?
I guess because first of all, yeah, I'm a hypocrite. I'm aware of my own hypocrisy, and I don't deny it. Does that make sense? Like I think that being
Sure.
in denial about it is the part that's the problem. Um, but I actually, for me, what's interesting about it is that me as a Latin teacher. Okay, so this is a 2-part thing, right? That kind of shows up in my conclusions. First of all, the effects of colonialism are still obvious in our society. They are visible in the borders of countries on
Yeah.
this planet. They are visible in the structural racism that exists in our country. They're visible in the, oh, it's our culture historical obsession with Confederate monuments that were put up nowhere near the Civil War and were in fact from a much later period when, racism was still alive and being expressed this way.
Yeah.
And so I sort of see all of these things as the continuing inheritance of colonialism that we have received and that we continue to live with. We live with colonialism. We just don't always identify it as such. So to me, a game that is okay with colonialism is a game that's okay with what we are all dealing with as a society now, which is inherently not okay.
Sure.
Does that make sense? Like
Yes.
I
Yeah.
feel like it's different to be okay with a thing that led to the mess we're in now.
Yeah.
Whereas with Roman stuff, on a human level, nothing was okay about the Romans. Julius Caesar went to Gaul and committed a genocide. Like, there's no other way around it. The Romans were fascinating, but they were not good people in our sense of what it is to be good. Nor did they care about being good in the way that we think about being good. And I think as a Latin teacher, I have to reflect on that, right? Because, okay, I teach in a Latin program that is a very diverse Latin program. I teach Latin to students of all backgrounds. I teach Latin to students from all social, positions as they come into my class. And I have to make sure that I am not glorifying something that is painful to them. I need to make sure that I'm not revisiting generational pain on them because of things that I've imbibed in the past that I haven't thought about. And
Yeah.
it's so easy to do. So if you look at when textbooks, including the ones that I used when I was a child, ones that I was given by districts to use in my classrooms, like there are stories told about slaves that are almost like cute, as if slavery is just sort of an
Oh
okay
boy.
part of Roman life. Like,
Yeah.
like in the Cambridge Latin course, which I love because I learned Latin from it. You've got slaves who have there's a slave who has a girlfriend and he sneaks out to see her when her master's out. And it's like, oh, he ancilla grumionum delectat. Like the girl pleases grumio. I mean, there's a,
Yeah.
there's a story that's cute that's since been taken out of most recent editions of this textbook. So they finally changed this particular part of the problem, right? But the master of the house goes and buys a woman named Melissa, and she's beautiful, and everybody in the house is like, ooh, Melissa, except for the wife who is angry.
Hmm.
That's not cute. Like
Yeah.
that's scary and it's gross. And there's an essay in Ecce Romani, which is another really popular textbook. I don't know if it's still there, but it was in the most recent. When I taught in North Carolina in 2017, 18, it was still in the books that I was given by the district to teach the kids. There's an essay by a slave named Davis who was so scared the day he got bought, but now he's an overseer and he loves his family. And he didn't understand why they paid so much more money for the guy who had rhetorical abilities, and they paid for him because they didn't understand. He didn't understand they were buying a teacher for their kids. They bought a teacher for their kids.
Uh-huh.
And it's presented as sort of like a cute, oh, Davis, you don't know how the world works. You're just a laborer, and this guy knows Greek. That's why he's worth more money than you. Like, what? And this shit, it's my podcast, we're just gonna go for it, is just, throughout texts about Latin. You have to get, and we all grow up taking Latin in high school, right? With this idea that Rome is great. The empire is so cool. Look at how advanced the Romans were. Look at how amazing Julius Caesar was. And then where do you go with that? What does that do to you? What values have you decided to imbibe yourself and impart to your kids? I am no doubt very poisoned in my way, right? By what I have gone. I love Roman stuff. I like reading about the political exploits of Julius Caesar, and I feel moments of admiration for him when he does things that are clever or when he outwits somebody, or because that's we imbibe that cultural perspective of the Romans. We take them on. We want to see through their eyes and not through the eyes of the people that they hurt. And we are naturally inclined to do that because we're not teaching Punic in school. We're not teaching ancient Celtic in school. We're
Yeah.
teaching Latin. And I feel like as a Latin teacher, it's my job to, I want to preserve this history, but it's also really important for me to think about the way that I'm teaching it, making adjustments to my curriculum, being honest about how foul a lot of this stuff was. And
Yeah.
if you don't do that, like, what are you communicating? You're siding with empire, which we don't like to do, given that we now realize that colonialism is bad. And why are we taking the side of the empire instead of the rebellion? But we do.
Yeah. So, what conclusion do you draw from all of that? Is that kind of the succinct statement, or what do you hope that a reader would take out of this series that you've offered?
So I hope that what a reader would take away. I mean, I'm inherently selfish, right? Most of the work that I do is for myself. Like I was thinking through a problem that I was having, like inside of my own heart and mind, right?
Hmm.
And I still haven't fully made peace with my feelings about Rome or about gladiators or any of that because it's a process. What I hope is that somebody reading that series will think about things that they were uncritical about in the past and maybe look at them with new eyes or accept the possibility that you're not as independent a thinker as you believe you are, that sometimes you fall for what the people of history are telling you because you wanted to identify with them and you wanted to see a historical hero. And maybe that's not what you actually got. And having the ability to know that your perspective might be off, having the ability to maybe start looking at things with fresh eyes, I think that matters in board gaming and out. That matters for personal relationships, that matters in politics, that matters, for the people sitting across the table from you, as well as the historical simulation that you're playing out. Um, it's not so much that you're supposed to get some sort of dogmatic conclusion from this. It's
Yeah.
supposed to make you think about stuff you didn't think about before and wonder why you didn't.
Well, it certainly has done that for me, and I'm saying this as somebody who has spent some time studying ancient Rome. Um, well, so thank you so much, Liz, for your series and for speaking with me today, joining with me on my podcast. Um, so, if listeners don't know you very well, where can they find you on the internet?
You can find me on the internet as Space Biff. I write these I write these very thoughtful, critical reviews of historical games, and also articles about things like colonialism in games. And I've been working. If you contribute to my Patreon, you might get some goods about Comancheria. But yeah, Space Biff.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Liz. I can be found anywhere on the internet as Beyond Solitaire and Happy Gaming.